So I, like many people, am a massive fan of Game of Thrones. When the first season came out, I was instantly hooked, so much so that I even read the books. And like quite a lot of people, I was very disappointed with the ending. And the first series that I started on the channel, A Folly of Thrones, was a continuation series of the Game of Thrones storyline following season 8. And the release of House of the Dragon has inspired me to write down a alternative timeline, shall we say, one in which Daenerys survives. So without further ado, welcome to the first episode of A Dragon's Reign. Please enjoy. The traitor Jon Snow entered the Red Keep with the intention of murdering his queen, but he hesitated, especially when Daenerys told him that she was pregnant with his child. He hesitated for just long enough for Grey Worm and the Unsullied to arrive and arrest him. Jon Snow found his way into the dungeons of King's Landing. Sansa Stark immediately demanded the release of her brother, but Queen Daenerys refused, making it clear that if the Starks were to storm the city, Jon would be the first to die. But no harm would come to Jon Snow as long as Sansa Stark bent the knee. Ravens were sent out to every lord and lady in the realm, inviting them to come and bend the knee to Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, Queen of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. Lords and ladies came from all across the realm to witness the coronation of Queen Daenerys and to bend the knee. The coronation took place in the Red Keep with Drogon fully present, as a reminder to the lords and ladies of who ruled. Lords such as Gendry Baratheon, Robin Arryn and Edmure Tully gladly bent the knee to their new queen. Sansa reluctantly bent the knee to protect her brother. An interesting arrival was Lady Dorna Lannister, widow of the late Kevin Lannister, who had been named Regent of the Westerlands until her last son came of age. She did not like the queen, nor did she wish to bend the knee, but the Lannisters could ill afford an enemy as powerful as Daenerys, and Dorna was also very fond of Tyrion, who had also been locked away, so she begrudgingly bent the knee. Even more interestingly was Garland Tyrell, who had been away in Essos and was the true heir to Highgarden. Garland respected his grandmother's wishes and declared his allegiance for Daenerys. He only asked that in exchange he be named Lord of the Reach, which Daenerys agreed to. The two actually got along quite well, and Garland would become Hand of the Queen. Yara Greyjoy was also present. She dreamed of Iron Island's independence, but Euron's influence reached from beyond the grave, and the Iron Islands were in no fit shape to survive on their own, so a deal was made between Yara and Daenerys. For now at least, the Iron Islands would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms, but they would have full autonomy and be allowed to govern themselves, and the Iron Islands would be allowed to secede legally. In exchange, Yara agreed to sit on the small council as mistress of ships. The new Princess of Dawn, Arianne Martell, was also present at the coronation. Arianne actually respected Daenerys and the two got along very well. They would eventually go on to become friends. But during the coronation the two held a private meeting, and after many hours the two eventually made an agreement. Dawn would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms under the same agreement that the Martells had with the Targaryens before, and Daenerys also promised that eventually House Targaryen and House Martell would be joined by blood again. It was now official for all to see. Daenerys was queen, but the most turbulent years of her reign was yet to come. The coronation went about as well as could be expected. It was quite obvious that most of the lords and ladies of the realm did not like Queen Daenerys, and she fully knew that these oaths of allegiance were hollow at best. Even in her current paranoid state, Daenerys was far smarter than to just have the lords executed then and there. For now at least, the ball was in their court. She looked instead to rebuilding her small council. Tyrion had been charged with treason and thrown into the dungeons. At first the position of Hand of the Queen was given to Grey Worm. Although a skilled tactician and formidable warrior, this was one job he was not suited for, which was very apparent to both of them. However, a better choice would present itself in Garland Tyrell. Daenerys didn't entirely trust him, although then again she didn't really trust anyone at this point, but she believed that he was a good man, a quality which was in short supply, and believed that his oath of allegiance was indeed genuine. Garland Tyrell would officially be made Hand of the Queen. The position of Mistress of Ships fell to Yara Greyjoy. Master of War naturally went to Grey Worm. The position of Master of Coin fell to a Braavosi named Paltar. He once worked for the Iron Bank but left after he became disillusioned with it, and he eventually found his way into the service of Queen Daenerys. The position of Mistress of Laws fell to a former slave called Zaela. She had been a translator in Yunkai when Daenerys liberated the city. Ever since then she had been fiercely loyal to her. Zaela was incredibly intelligent and fair-minded, but she had a ruthless quality about her. This made her perfect for the position. The position of Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard fell to a brutal Dothraki blood rider called Azak. However, he most certainly did not like sitting on the small council. Surprisingly, Daenerys chose to keep the position of Member of Dawn, which had been created by Tywin Lannister, around, and Moria Martell sat as its member. However, very interestingly, the position of Grand Maester was filled by Samwell Tarly. This surprised many, as Samwell Tarly had no love for the Queen and Daenerys certainly didn't trust him, but Daenerys knew that in his heart he was a kind-hearted man who genuinely cared about the people, and she remembered how well Ser Jorah Mormont spoke of him, and after all, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. As a further incentive, Gilly and Little Sam were invited to stay at the Red Keep, but the most surprising and interesting of all was the position of Master of Whispers was filled by Bran Stark. During the coronation, Bran had a private meeting with Daenerys. No one knows what was discussed during this meeting, but afterwards Bran agreed to become Master of Whispers. No one could understand why Bran accepted this job, but then again, he sees and knows more than anyone else, so he must have his reasons. The choices for the members of the small council angered a great many lords. Ignorant lords saw this as a council of foreigners, and the Citadel was also outraged by the fact that Daenerys had taken it upon herself to appoint a Grand Maester, which was typically the Citadel's choice. But in the days and months to come, both the small council and the crown would be tested to its limits. Daenerys gathered her small council together in one of the last remaining intact rooms within the Red Keep. There she would give her speech about breaking the wheel. Together they would liberate everyone from Lonely Light to Ashai, from Sophorios to the Shivering Sea. Everyone would be free, their chains broken, and the wheel which had oppressed so many for so long would be destroyed. Her hand, Garland Tyrell, commended her vision, but politely advised that they focus on the more immediate issues first. Winter had come. King's Landing was in ruins, its people starving and largely homeless, and rebellions and uprisings were sprouting up all across the realm. There were reports of uprisings and rebellions in the Iron Islands, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and the Reach, and a possible rebellion brewing in the Stormlands. Although officially the Great Houses were not part of these rebellions, they weren't exactly doing much to stop them, so it fell on Daenerys to send her own armies to stop these rebellions before they got out of control. The two closest threats to King's Landing itself came from the Riverlands. The remnants of the Faith Militant had regrouped in Harrenhal under a new High Septon. There they offered food and shelter to anyone who wanted it. Their numbers had swollen quite considerably, and they denounced Daenerys as an abomination. This army of fanatics had to be dealt with. Of perhaps greater concern, there was an army coming from the north, but this was not a Stark army. This army named themselves the Winter Wolves after their ancestors, and they were led by a man called Willem Snow. He was a battle-hardened veteran who first served as a common soldier in King Robb Stark's army. He would fight in the War of the Five Kings, the rebellion against the Boltons, the Great War, and the war against Cersei. His men referred to him as the Grey Wolf, as despite being a fairly young man, battle had aged him considerably. He had a very strong sense of honour, and his intention was not to conquer, but to punish all those who he deemed as cowards and traitors. Naturally, Daenerys was pretty high up on his list. He was well respected by Northerners, and he used this respect to gather a mighty host of thousands, who like him were battle-hardened veterans. His army crossed the neck, seized the twins, and put every member of House Frey to the sword, and his ranks continued to swell as more and more soldiers from the Riverlands flocked to join his banner. Originally, Daenerys wanted to use Drogon to burn them to ash. She was counselled against this, however. Samwell Tarly pointed out that when Maegor the Cruel used his own dragon, dragon to put down rebellions, all he did was create more. A more convincing argument came from her hand, who reminded the queen that with her armies off fighting across the realm, and aside from a few hundred Dothraki, Drogon was the only real garrison the capital had. Should she and Drogon leave, the capital would undoubtedly fall, for now at least. It was up to Grey Worm and the Unsullied. Grey Worm decided that it would be best to deal with the Faith first, as he did not believe they would put up much of a fight. So he set up camp just outside of Harrenhal and sent a small group of scouts to monitor the Grey Wolf's progress. But it would seem that Grey Worm underestimated both the castle and its defenders. Harrenhal may have been a ruin, but it was still an impressive fortress. And since the Faith took refuge there, they had been joined by a great many pious and lordless knights. These knights helped train the Faith, and by the time of the Unsullied's arrival, the Faith had gone from a mob to a well-disciplined army. Twice they assaulted the castle and twice they were beaten back. As Grey Worm sat in his tent debating his next move, he could almost feel the wolf's jaws closing around his neck. Thankfully, help would arrive in the shape of Lord Edmure, who was leading a host of Tully bannermen. He had been hesitant to confront the forces of the Grey Wolf, as he was not sure if his men would be willing to fight against their former brothers in arms. But he knew that they would have no issue in dealing with a bunch of religious madmen. With the Tullys taking up the siege of Harrenhal, Grey Worm marched his army north to confront the Winter Wolves. The scouts reported that the Grey Wolf had made his camp near the Red Fork, so Grey Worm decided this would be where he would strike. The Unsullied attacked in the dead of night, taking the wolves by surprise, in a battle that would become known as the Battle of the Empty Sheets. Despite a fierce defense, the Winter Wolves were defeated and the Unsullied stood victorious. Although this was a victory, something was very wrong. It was too easy. There should have been more wolves. Over 3/4 of the tents were empty. Where were Grey Worm's scouts, and more importantly, where was the Grey Wolf? The answer was that he was on his way to King's Landing with his other 8,000 men. The Grey Wolf had learned much in his years of campaigning, and an incredibly valuable lesson that he had learned was deception. He had Grey Worm's scouts intercepted and killed. He had been the one sending Grey Worm the reports, false reports, all to get Grey Worm to attack a ghost army while his real army slipped past them. After realizing that he had been tricked, Grey Worm ordered his forces to return to King's Landing with all haste, but the Grey Wolf had his men place obstacles on the way to King's Landing to slow the Unsullied down, and bands of rebels and outlaws continued to harass the Unsullied army as they marched. All of this, plus the fact that it was still winter, made progress for Grey Worm's army very slow, and King's Landing was in serious trouble. It was still largely decimated after Daenerys' attack. Work on repairing the city had started, but it was incredibly slow. After hearing of the Winter Wolves' approach, Garland Tyrell, Hand of the Queen, personally took charge of rebuilding the city's defences, but in the short amount of time that he had, he was only able to plug the breaches in the wall with makeshift wooden barricades, which would certainly not stand up to much. The city's garrison also left much to be desired. The Master of Coin, Paltar, had already advised that the Queen make a permanent garrison which would be drawn from the inhabitants of the city. By the time of the Winter Wolves' arrival, the city's garrison consisted of a few hundred Dothraki and approximately 3,000 poorly equipped and poorly trained peasants, mostly from Fleabottom and largely unreliable. Certainly no match for the battle-hardened veterans of the Grey Wolf's army. Rather reluctantly, the Queen gave command of the city's garrison over to Sir Bronn of the Blackwater, who had remained in the city and was approached by both the Queen and her Master of Coin. The Queen, or anyone for that matter, did not trust Bronn, for he was a snake, but he was an excellent warrior and they needed all the warriors that they could get. So Daenerys said that if he aided in the defense of the city, she would honor the agreement he made with Tyrion. Naturally, Bronn was skeptical, as he had heard this offer so many times before, but Paltar reminded him that he didn't exactly have many better offers. So reluctantly, Sir Bronn agreed. The defenders still had one weapon though, Drogon. The Queen wanted to burn the Grey Wolves' army on the road, but she was counselled against this, as they could simply scatter into the forest at the first sign of Drogon. Instead, they should wait until the Winter Wolves were right outside their walls, right in the open. There in the open, they would be trapped between Dragon's Fire and and the walls of King's Landing. So the plan was agreed and final preparations were made, and a couple days later when the Winter Wolves arrived at King's Landing, the trap was sprung. On the day of the battle, the ground shook as a mighty roar rang across the battlefield, and the mighty dragon Drogon, being ridden by the Queen herself, descended from the sky. The enemy had walked right into her trap. Little did she know she had also walked right into theirs. As Drogon began to incinerate the Grey Wolf's army, he gave the signal and unveiled his secret weapon. In tents scattered around his camp, he had hidden several scorpions, which now took aim and fired. Volley after volley was flung out into the sky. Drogon desperately tried to avoid the incoming bolts, and was even able to take out a couple of scorpions, but the Grey Wolf made sure to scatter his scorpions around his camp so they couldn't be taken out all at once, and soon enough 2 shots found their mark. One struck Drogon's wing while the other struck his lower body. He was forced to flee the battlefield back to King's Landing, where he fell into the dragon pit. He was injured but alive, and thankfully Daenerys was relatively unscathed, but she was utterly distraught by the sight of her beloved Drogon lying on the ground. She immediately summoned Samwell Tarly, telling him to heal Drogon and that failure was not an option. While this was happening, the Grey Wolf's forces were assaulting the walls. As predicted, the makeshift walls of King's Landing did not stand up to much bombardment. Several breaches were made and the Grey Wolf's forces began charging through them. Also, as predicted, a large amount of the garrison simply fled. Sir Bronn of the Blackwater and Garland Tyrell stood shoulder to shoulder, desperately trying to hold the Winter Wolves at one of the main breaches, when suddenly, above the sounds of battle, a faint sound of drums could be heard in the distance. The drums grew louder, and the Winter Wolves and their commander the Grey Wolf could hear them as well, and from his vantage point the Grey Wolf could see the shapes of ships appearing in the distance. As the ships came closer and closer to King's Landing, people could begin to see the sails of the ships and their banners, the banners of House Velaryon.